The bridge broke, and the wizard fell, and the world above went silent, in a way that those who stood upon the stone had never heard before. It was the 15th day of January, in the year 3019 of the Third Age, and the fellowship had come to the heart of Khazad Dum, the great hall of Dwarodelf, where the pillars rose like trees of stone, and the darkness was so vast that the light of Gandalf's staff could not find its end. The Balrog had come out of the deep, a shadow and a flame, a terror that had slept beneath the mountain since the elder days, and Gandalf had stood upon the narrow bridge to face it, because there was no other choice. "You cannot pass," he had said, and the words were not spoken as a man speaks, but as a power speaks, as Olorin would have spoken in the Elder World when the Valar still walked openly. The Balrog had raised its shadow, and its fire had risen to meet his light, and for a heartbeat the two powers held each other in balance, light against dark, flame against flame. Then the Balrog fell, and its whip took Gandalf about the knee, and the stone of the bridge, worked by the hands of Durin's sons many thousands of years before, gave way. Those above saw him fall. Aragorn cried out, and Boromir shouted, and Legolas loosed an arrow that was lost in the dark. Frodo felt the loss as a cold wind, as if a light that had been walking beside him since the Shire had suddenly gone out. Gimli, who knew the pride of the dwarves and the depth of their delving, understood better than any of them that no fall in Khazad Dum should have been so long, for the abyss beneath the bridge was not a shaft dug by hands, but a wound in the mountain that had no bottom that any dwarf had ever measured. Gandalf did not fall as a man falls, tumbling and helpless. He fell as a flame falls when it is pulled down by a greater wind. He fell as a star falls when it is cast out of heaven. He clung to the shadow that had seized him, and the shadow clung to him, and together they went down into a darkness that had never known the light of sun or moon, or even the pale light of the stars as seen through the doors of the mountain. For a long while there was only falling, and the sound of falling, stone striking stone far below, water striking stone farther below still, and then a silence that was deeper than any silence that belongs to the world of air and light. Part 2. The Fall That Had No End. The chasm beneath Khazad Dum was not a pit, and not a shaft, and not a mine. No dwarf had made it, and no elf had sung it into being, and no design of owlie had shaped its walls. It was a place where the root of the mountain had never finished growing, where the stone had remained soft from the making of the world, where the deeps had stayed open because nothing had ever been commanded to close them. The Dwarves of Moria had delved for more than 5,000 years, level after level, hall after hall, stair after stair, until their city was like a honeycomb within the stone. Yet below the lowest hall that Durin ever claimed, below the deepest mine where mithril was found in veins thin as a hair, there was another world entirely, a world of black air and cold stone that no map had ever marked. Gandalf and the Balrog fell through all of it. The air grew thin and then thick again, cold and then warm, still and then moving with a slow breath that did not come from any wind. The walls changed as they fell. At first they were carved stone, then rough stone, then stone that had been melted and cooled, then stone that had never been stone at all but something older, something that had been pressed together before the mountains were raised. The light of the hall above became a speck and then was gone. The fire of the Balrog became the only light, a sullen red that showed nothing, because there was nothing that wished to be shown. Gandalf held to the demon, and the demon held to Gandalf, fire and wizard locked together, and between the burning of the Balrog whip and the freezing of the abyssal air, Gandalf remembered a name that he had not spoken aloud for more than 2,000 years. He remembered that he was not only Gandalf. He remembered that he had been Olorin in Valinor, that he had walked in the gardens of Lorien, that he had learned pity from Nienna the Weeper, that he had been sent across the sea not to rule and not to conquer, but to kindle. The remembering was not a comfort. It was a weight, because Olorin had known what things lived in the deep before the world was made, and Gandalf the Grey had allowed himself to forget them. The fall lasted longer than any fall that belongs to the world of height and depth, as men understand height and depth. It lasted time enough for the heart to beat many hundreds of times, time enough for hope to leave and return and leave again. Then water took them. Part 3. Water that had never seen light. They struck water that was not water as the world above knows water. It was not the bright, cold water of Keled Zaram, the Mirrormere, where Durin had looked and seen the crown of stars. It was not the dark water of the lake before the western doors, where the Watcher had waited. It was black water, old water, water that had gathered in the deepest hollow of the earth, when the mountains were still young and had never moved since. It was water that had never felt sun or moon or starlight, water that had never been touched by rain, water that lay so deep that the weight of the mountain above had pressed all air out of it until it was heavy as stone. The impact should have killed any living thing. It would have killed a man, and it would have killed an elf, and it would have killed a dwarf, for they are bound to the world by breath and bone. It did not kill Gandalf because Gandalf was not bound as they are bound, and it did not kill the Balrog because the Balrog was not alive as living things are alive, but was a spirit of fire bound in a form of shadow. They struck the water, and the fire hissed, and a great cloud of steam rose and was instantly swallowed by the cold, and the darkness, which had been absolute, became suddenly full of sound, as if the water had been covering a listening that had been waiting for a very long time. The Balrog fled. For the first time since it had been awakened by the dwarves delving too deep in the year 1980 of the Third Age, the ancient demon was afraid, and its fear was not of Gandalf. It untangled itself from the wizard grasp and fled through black water that came first to the waist and then to the chest, and then was gone, because beyond the water there was stone again, but not the stone of Khazad Dum. This was different stone, stone that had been gnawed. Gandalf followed. He had taken hold of the Balrog on the bridge for a purpose, and he would not release that purpose until the end was reached. The water fell behind him, the dark closed behind him, and ahead the Balrog flame lit a tunnel that had never been built. Part 4. The Ways that were gnawed. No dwarf had made those tunnels, no elf had sung them, no hammer of Aule had shaped them. They were burrows, vast and weaving, twisting back upon themselves in ways that no builder with eyes would ever devise, branching and rejoining without reason, rising and falling without purpose. The walls were not smooth as worked stone is smooth, and not rough as broken stone is rough. They were scored with long parallel marks, furrows deep as a man is tall, as if something with claws larger than any beast of Arda had dragged itself through living rock, and had eaten the rock as it went, and had still been hungry after. The tunnels went in every direction, and they went nowhere at all, and they had no end and no beginning that any light could find, and they had been there for an age that had no count in years or centuries. Far, far below the deepest delving of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. That was what Gandalf would say long afterward, when he had returned and was Gandalf the White, when Aragorn asked him what had happened beneath the earth, and when Galadriel looked at him with eyes that had seen the two trees and asked without words. He would say those words, and then he would say no more, and when they pressed, he would turn his head and speak of other matters. On that day when he spoke them, his voice was quiet, and his eyes were far away, because he was remembering what it was like to stand in the place where the gnawing happened, and he did not wish to remember it again. Yet to understand what happened next, one must stay with him in that place a little while longer, for there are things that are known only by being remembered fully. Gandalf pursued the Balrog through the gnawed ways, and the fire lit the tunnels ahead with a sick red light that made the claw marks look like writing in a forgotten tongue. The air was so still that it seemed never to have moved. The stone was warm, not with the heat of fire, but with the heat of a living body, as if the mountain itself were breathing very slowly far, far above, and the breath took a very long time to reach the deep. And then Gandalf became aware that they were not alone. At first it was only a pressure at the edge of thought, the feeling that is felt in a dark room when eyes are upon you before you see the eyes. Then it was a silence within the silence, a more deliberate quiet, a listening that had shape. Then it was a stirring in the walls themselves, not the crumbling of stone but the flexing of stone, as if the stone were not stone at all but something that had taken the shape of stone for a very long time and was now remembering that it could move. The Balrog stopped. Part 5. The Fear of Fire. The Balrog, which had faced the hosts of the Elves in Beleriand, which had served Morgoth when the world was young, which had driven Durin Sixth from his hall and slain 2 kings of the Dwarves, stopped in the middle of a tunnel wider than any hall of Dwarodelf, and looked about itself with sudden and terrible uncertainty. Its flame dimmed, its shadow drew inward and became less vast. It raised its whip and then lowered it again, because there was nothing to strike, and because the thing that was near did not fear the whip. The tunnels around it were empty to the eye, and yet they were full. The darkness ahead was empty, and yet it was looking back. Gandalf understood before the Balrog did. He understood because he had been Olorin, and had stood among the Maiar who served Manwe and Varda. He had seen the beginning of things. He had heard the music before the world was made. He had been there when the theme of Eru was first sung, and when the discord of Melkor entered it, and a part of the harmony turned away and curled in upon itself, and hid rather than be remade. The Nameless Things were older than the Balrog. They were older than Sauron, who was once Mairon the Admirable. They were older than Morgoth when he first took his dark crown. They were not fallen Maiar, for all fallen Maiar, even the Balrogs, had chosen a master and taken a form for the sake of dominion. They were not corrupted elves, or beasts bred by sorcery. They were something that had never been counted among the peoples of Arda at all. They were not evil as Sauron is evil, for evil desires and plans and builds. They were hunger that had been left over from the making, a hunger that could not create and therefore could only consume, a thing that gnaws at the roots of the world because it remembers that it was once part of the song and cannot remember the tune. And they saw Gandalf. Not with eyes, for they had no eyes that light could show. They saw him the way that darkness sees light when a light is brought into a place that has never known light. They saw the small flame that he carried, the flame that he had kept hidden, even from himself, while he walked as an old man in a grey cloak through the Shire and the wilds. In Valinor that flame had a name. Among the Valar it was called the Secret Fire, the flame imperishable, the fire that Eru kindled in the void, and that no shadow can ever put out. Of all the Maiar who came into the world, only a few were ever permitted to bear any part of it within them, and among those few was Olorin, not because he was the strongest, but because he asked for the least. He asked not for power, and not for dominion, and not for knowledge. He asked for pity, and pity is the form that the secret fire takes when it walks among the suffering. Gandalf had dimmed that flame deliberately while he was the grey pilgrim, for the grey was meant to wander and whisper and kindle hope in small places, not to blaze as a beacon. But in the absolute dark far below the world, with death upon him and the ancient gnawers turning their attention toward him, the flame woke on its own. It did not blaze, it simply was, a small warm point in the endless cold, and the nameless things moved toward it the way that deep things move toward any light, not to worship and not to destroy, but to know. Part 6. That which has no name. What came toward him was not one thing, it was many and yet it was one, the way that the roots of a single ancient tree are many and yet one tree. The stone rippled, and a great pale shape eased itself out of the wall, and then eased itself back into the wall, and in the moment when it was separate, Gandalf saw it plainly despite the dark. It was vast, far vaster than the Balrog, vaster than any dragon that had ever flown over Middle-earth, and yet it had no fixed shape at all. It was white as the bone of the earth, and slick as the inside of a shell, and it moved not by walking but by flowing, and as it flowed, it left behind it a furrow that was a new tunnel, a new gnawing, because that was all it could do. It could only gnaw. For uncounted ages it had gnawed at the root of the world, asking the same question that hunger always asks, which is whether there is anything at all that can fill it. Behind it other shapes moved. One was like a great worm with no head and 100 mouths along its length, each mouth opening and closing without sound. One was like a shadow that had grown limbs and then forgotten why limbs were needed, so the limbs trailed and flexed without purpose. One was only a thickness in the dark, a cold place that was colder than the surrounding cold, a void within the void. They came and they surrounded Gandalf and the Balrog, and they did not make a sound that the ears of the living could hear. The Balrog tried to burn them. It drew itself up to its full height and spread its shadow and let out the roar that had broken the courage of armies in the First Age, and fire poured from its nostrils and ran along the walls and filled the tunnel with choking heat. The Nameless Things did not flinch. Fire meant nothing to them. They had been there when fire was given its name and its purpose. They had been there before the Valar taught flame to be bright and warm. The Balrog was a spirit of fire that Morgoth had corrupted and bound to a shape, and the Nameless Things knew Morgoth, or remembered something older than Morgoth, and they had no fear of his servant. One of the pale, flowing things passed over the Balrog without touching it, and where it passed, the flame went dimmer, not because it was quenched, but because it was seen to be small, a little fire pretending to be great. Then the Nameless Things turned wholly to Gandalf. Part 7. The Flame That Does Not Burn. He felt them touch his mind, not with words and not with force. The touch was older than language, older than thought, as elves and men know thought. It was a reaching, a questioning, a remembering. They had felt something like him once, very long ago, before they fled into the deep, before they began to gnaw. They had felt the presence of a great singing and a great light, and then a discord within the singing, and then a choosing. In the choosing they had chosen the deep, because the deep was the only place where the singing could not follow. They had chosen to hide, not out of loyalty to the dark, but out of weariness with the song. Now the singing had come into the deep, not as a command and not as a hunt. It had come as a small old man in a grey cloak, burning with a flame that did not burn. Gandalf understood that they were asking who he was in the only way that they could ask, by pressing closer and tasting the shape of his spirit. He could have answered with any of his many names. He could have said that he was Gandalf Greyhame, the Grey Pilgrim, that he was Mithrandir to the Elves, and Tharkan to the Dwarves, and Incanus in the south, that he was a wizard and an enemy of Sauron, and had fallen from a bridge. None of those names would have meant anything to the things that gnaw the world. They did not know Sauron, they did not know bridges, they did not know wizards. So he answered with his first name, the name he had borne before sun and moon were set to sail, the name that only Manwe and Varda and Nienna had called him, in the time when he was still Olorin in the gardens of Lorien. He said without words that he was Olorin, servant of pity, bearer of the secret fire in its gentlest form. The effect was immediate and strange. The Nameless Things recoiled, not in terror but in recognition, the way a sleeper recoils when a word from a long-forgotten dream is spoken aloud and the dream is suddenly remembered. The pale, flowing thing that had dimmed the Balrog drew back and curled upon itself, and the worm with many mouths closed all its mouths at once, and the cold place grew a little less cold. They had known of Olorin, or rather they had heard of him in the time before time, when they were still part of the music and had not yet turned away. They had heard of the Maiar, who was accounted wisest among those who served Manwe, not because he was mighty, but because he would walk unseen among the children and give them pity and kindle their hearts when they were despairing. They had heard of him, and they had not heeded him then, because they had chosen the deep instead. Now the deep had brought him to them, and they knew him at last. Part 8. Pity in the Abyss. One of them, the one that was most like a thickness in the dark, moved forward and touched him, or rather let him feel itself more closely. The touch was cold beyond any cold that belongs to Arda, beyond the cold of Caradhras, beyond the cold of the Helcarax. It was the cold of the void before the world was made, the cold that was when Eru was alone and had not yet spoken let it be. Gandalf felt that cold and did not flinch, because the flame within him was warm enough to bear it. And in the cold he felt something else that he had not expected to feel at all. He felt loneliness that was older than the world. The Nameless Things were not evil. That was the thing Gandalf could never explain afterward, and why he chose never to try. In the world above, evil has shape and purpose. It builds towers and forges rings, and gathers armies and desires dominion over others. The Nameless Things desired nothing. They gnawed because gnawing was the only act that had not been taken from them when they turned away from creation. They could not make, and they could not grow, and they could not love. They could only consume the world a little at a time, not from malice but from hunger. And the hunger had lasted so long that it had become their whole existence, until they no longer remembered what it was to be full. Gandalf felt their loneliness, and his pity, which was the form of his power, woke fully for the first time since he had come to Middle-earth. Without thought and without plan and without any of the prudence that had made him Gandalf the Grey, he let the flame within him be seen, not as a blast, and not as a weapon, and not as the terrible white light he would later show when he returned, but as a simple warmth, as a memory of the gardens of Lorien, where he had once walked and learned pity from Nienna herself, the Vala who weeps for the wounds of the world. He offered them that memory. He showed them without words the light of Valinor, as it had been when the two trees still shone, the green of leaves that had never known blight, the sound of water that was not black and still, but bright and running over stones in the sun. He offered it not to change them, for they were too old to be changed by any single light, but to let them remember that they had once been part of a song that had been beautiful before the discord entered it, and that the beauty had not been wholly lost. The Nameless Things shivered. For the first time in an age that could not be numbered, something other than hunger passed through them. The pale, flowing thing lifted what might have been a head and let out a sound that was not a sound, a long sigh that moved through the stone and made the gnawed tunnels hum like a struck bell. The gnawing, which had never ceased since the beginning of the world, ceased for a heartbeat, then for 2 heartbeats, then for 3. In that pause, the world seemed to hold its breath. In that pause, the Balrog tried to flee again. It turned, seeking any tunnel that led upward, any crack that promised air, and it found the path that had been gnawed long ago and that still led toward the roots of the endless stair, the stair that the dwarves had hewn from the lowest dungeon to the highest peak, a stair of many thousands of steps that no living foot was ever meant to climb in one journey. The Nameless Things let it go. They had no interest in the servant of Morgoth. Morgoth had promised them dominion and had given them only deeper darkness, and they had forgotten him as they forget everything that belongs to the world above. They let the Balrog run, and Gandalf let it run as well, because he knew that fire and shadow must still strive upon the peak of Ziraxigil before the end of his fall was reached. But before he followed, Gandalf did one thing more. Part 9. The memory he carried back. He laid his hand, his real hand, the hand of Olorin that had not been weary for an age, against the wall of the gnawed tunnel, against the stone that was not stone, against the flesh of the nameless thing that was nearest to him. The stone was warm from his flame and cold from its own void, both at once, and the touch was a promise. Without words, he said that he would remember them. He said that he knew who they were, or rather what they had chosen to become, and that he did not hate them for it. He said that above there was still light, and still song, and still pity, and that he would carry the memory of their loneliness with him back into the world, if the world permitted him to return. He said that they had been part of the music once, and that no part of the music is ever wholly lost while the theme of Eru endures. The Nameless Things understood. They drew back into the walls, and into the dark, and into themselves, and the tunnels were empty again, or as empty as they ever were. Gandalf stood alone in the absolute dark, with the warmth of his own flame about him like a small cloak, and he listened to the gnawing begin again, a little slower than before, a little less hungry, as if the things that gnawed had been given something to think about that was not hunger for the first time since they fled the singing. Then he turned and followed the Balrog toward the endless stair. What followed would become legend, though few ever heard the true accounting. The stair rose for many thousands of steps, and Gandalf climbed it with the Balrog ever above him, fighting step by step, wound about flame, until they came out upon the peak of Zirak-Zigil above the clouds. There they fought for 2 days and 2 nights under sun and stars, and Gandalf cast the Balrog down, and the demon was unmade. And Gandalf himself died, and his spirit left the world, and passed out of thought and time, and was sent back, for his task was not finished. That is the story that was written in the Red Book. That is the tale that Aragorn heard, and that Galadriel guarded. That is what Gandalf chose to tell, for it was needful, and it was true as far as it went. What he did not tell, what he never told to Aragorn, or to Frodo, or to Gimli, or to any other, was that the Balrog was not the only ancient thing he had faced in the dark. He did not speak of the Nameless Things because there are no words for them in any tongue of elves, or men, or dwarves, and because to speak of them is in some measure to call them, and the world above was not ready to be remembered by them. He did not speak of them because he pitied them, and the pity of Olorin is a private thing that is not for songs or for councils. Yet those who knew him well afterward noticed a change that they could not name. He was more patient with the small and the weak, more gentle with the frightened, less swift to judge the counsels of the wise. And when he spoke of the deep places of the world, even in passing, even when he spoke of the mines of Moria, or the foundations of Barad-dûr, or the abysses of the sea, he would grow quiet for a moment, and look far away toward the roots of the mountains, as if he were listening for a gnawing that only he could hear. He had gone down into the void, and had found things older than Sauron, older than the shape of evil as the world knows evil, things that had been lost since before the first sunrise ever rose. And they had known him. They had looked at the small warm flame he carried, a flame that no darkness can quench, and they had remembered the name Olorin, the one who had been sent to kindle pity in a world that is often pitiless. In the deepest dark, before the world was shaped, and while it was still being shaped, before the first light was kindled and long after, the Nameless Things wait and gnaw. They wait because waiting is all that is left to them. They gnaw because gnawing is all they can do. And for one brief moment outside of time, a wizard fell among them, and they ceased to gnaw, and they remembered that they had once been part of a song. Then the wizard rose out of the dark toward the peak and the light, and the gnawing began again. But something in the darkness was different in a way that no eye could see and no tongue could tell, because for the first time since the music was broken, the ancient hunger had been met, not with fear and not with fire, but with pity. And pity is the one thing that the void had never known before, and having known it once, the void could never be wholly empty again.